On September 12th, the New York Times published a lengthy analysis. As a Cuban-American politician, U.S. Secretary of State Rubio led a new, tougher Latin American policy during Trump's second term. Not only did he push for crackdowns on drug traffickers, but he also designated several Latin American drug cartels as foreign terrorist organizations and even attempted to overthrow leftist regimes in Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua. For years, smearing China as a security threat has been one of Rubio's usual tactics. This time, as he takes action in Latin America, he still doesn't forget to target China. In an interview, a U.S. State Department official claimed that Rubio is suppressing China's exploitative practices for the sake of regional security and stability. In August, under the pretext of anti-narcotics operations, the Trump administration deployed military forces near Venezuelan waters, causing a sudden escalation in tensions. Last week, the U.S. military struck a drug trafficking vessel in the Caribbean linked to Venezuelan drug traffickers, resulting in 11 deaths. However, Venezuela's Minister of Interior, Justice and Peace, on the 11th, Ceballos stated that none of those killed by the U.S. military were members of the notorious criminal organizations. They were not members of the Aragua train gang, nor were they drug traffickers, but rather civilians. The New York Times pointed out that for decades, U.S. anti-narcotics officials in Latin America and the Caribbean have tried to cut off drug trafficking routes by intercepting boats, trucks, and even horses carrying drugs and arresting smugglers. However, in Rubio's view, these measures are far from sufficient. He has already helped the Trump administration shift toward a more aggressive and deadly strategy, bypassing legal procedures and using military force to destroy suspected drug trafficking vessels. Among senior officials in the Trump administration, no one was tougher than Rubio. As a Republican from Florida, for 14 years as a senator, Rubio has pressured 3 U.S. administrations to adopt aggressive policies in Latin America. For a long time, Rubio has sought to overthrow leftist strongmen in the region, hardline leaders, and even helped orchestrate the Trump administration's large-scale immigration deportation operations, sending some migrants to a notorious prison in El Salvador. The article also notes that in order to implement Trump's hegemonic policies in the Western Hemisphere, Rubio tried to weaken the increasingly close economic ties between Latin America and China, wielding a big stick to pressure Latin American governments and accusing China of exploitation. In the face of U.S. pressure and attempts to sow discord, the article points out that some Latin American leaders are worried that the U.S. will once again flex its hegemonic muscles, for example, the President of Mexico. President Sheinbaum has for months been warning the United States opposing any unilateral military action on Mexican territory. Venezuelan President Maduro specifically called out Rubio on a television program, criticizing him and saying that such madness and extremism would lead the Trump administration into the worst possible situation in Latin America. Maduro warned that U.S. military actions in the relevant regions could turn into a disastrous defeat. In fact, China maintains friendly relations with Latin American countries. This relationship has not only irritated Rubio. In late August, the commander of the U.S. Southern Command stated at the South American Defense Conference in Argentina that China is infiltrating the Western Hemisphere and extracting resources. According to a commentary by the mainland's Observer Network, the irony is that while the U.S. repeatedly tries to sow discord in the increasingly close China-Latin America relationship, Trump himself last month nonchalantly claimed that he is no longer worried at all about Latin American countries drawing closer to China. In summary, first, the new U.S. administration is paying more attention to controlling Latin America. Diplomats believe that Trump is pursuing strategic retrenchment, focusing his efforts on regaining control over North America and Latin America. Second, in contrast, China's recent cooperation with Latin America has placed greater emphasis on economic benefits and practical gains, while in terms of political activities, compared to the Biden era, there has been a slowdown, which is believed to be an effort to reduce misunderstandings during the period of the China-US trade war. Third, no matter how American politicians try to smear China, the US's condescending hegemonic behavior, whether it's imposing tariffs, using missiles to directly kill so-called drug traffickers, or forcing other countries to invest in the US, and so on, makes it clear that the real daily exploitation of other countries is done by the US itself. No one else comes close to taking first place in this regard. In fact, the US not only forces other countries to invest in America, but also compels these foreign companies to hire Americans. However, the recent incident where the US detained personnel from a South Korean company will seriously undermine foreign investors' confidence in investing in the US. At the end of last month, South Korean President Lee Jae-myung and Trump just held a meeting at the White House to showcase the alliance between South Korea and the US and to solidify the trade agreement reached by the two countries in July. This agreement includes the establishment of a $350 billion investment fund in South Korea to support the expansion of Korean companies in the US, with $150 billion of that earmarked for the shipbuilding industry. In addition, South Korean private enterprises also pledged to invest an extra $150 billion in the United States. However, on September 4th, agents from the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement suddenly arrested 475 workers suspected of being illegal immigrants at a Hyundai factory in Georgia. The incident, in which U.S. immigration authorities detained a large number of Koreans, made headlines in most South Korean newspapers. Images of workers being shackled and loaded onto buses sparked outrage among the South Korean public. After a round of negotiations, the South Korean government was finally able to secure the release of these detained Koreans. On September 12th, 330 of those arrested in the U.S. were finally flown back to South Korea. By this time, it had been 8 days since they were detained by U.S. law enforcement on the 4th. Among those who returned was a pregnant woman. Although the people have come back, the diplomatic friction between South Korea and the U.S., triggered by this incident, as well as the nationwide debate in South Korea about emigrating to the U.S., are far from over. According to reports from Yonhap news agency, Asahi Shimbun and Reuters, on the afternoon of the 12th, the terminal at Incheon International Airport in South Korea was packed with journalists, company and government officials, and the families of those released. There were also protesters displaying homemade banners demanding an apology from U.S. President Trump. After stepping onto South Korean soil, these workers poured out their grievances, recounting the nightmare of their arrest and detention. A worker from South Korean battery manufacturer LG Energy Solution recalled that U.S. ICE agents deployed throughout the entire factory in less than 10 minutes. Choi Young-hee, a 44-year-old employee of LG Energy Solution, appeared haggard and unshaven. She said, "It wasn't until they put handcuffs and chains on me that I realized how serious the situation was." A family member revealed that her son told her that 5 or 6 officers pointed guns at him from behind, ordered him to lie down, and confiscated all his belongings, including his phone, before arresting him. The released workers also revealed the harsh conditions of their detention. John Sang-guk, 56, said that at first 70 people were crammed into one room, but there were only 5 or 6 toilets, and all the toilets were open. He added, "They were handcuffed and shackled, and only later were they transferred to 2-person cells." When asked about life in the detention center, one of the workers said that the constant worry and fear was the worst part. Others complained about the quality of the food and that the drinking water tasted of bleach. Upon learning of the workers' situation, their families felt both anxious and angry. One woman said, "I couldn't even ask my husband whether they were really chained and tied up with zip ties. That's what hurts and angers me the most." According to a Reuters report on the 12th, South Korean officials said that Trump encouraged the released South Korean workers to stay in the U.S. to train Americans. However, the wife of one of the contractor's employees told reporters, "If something like this happens, what family would allow their children to go to the U.S. again? I absolutely will not let them go to the U.S. again, not after being detained like that." Choi Young-hee also said, "I don't think anyone would want to stay. After going through all of this, I'm not sure if we'll ever go back." A report by Nikkei Asia on the 12th pointed out, the return of 330 people arrested in the United States to South Korea brings a week-long story to a close. However, the drama has caused the South Korean government and public to question Trump's coveted high-tech investment promises. Reports say the factory involved is a joint venture between battery manufacturer LG Energy Solution and Hyundai Motor Group, which is expected to start operations next year. Hyundai Motor said the construction of the factory will be delayed by at least 2 to 3 months due to the incident. Bloomberg News reported that the U.S. special investigation has cast a shadow on South Korea's multi-billion-dollar investment plan in the United States. The detention of workers related to South Korea's flagship investment projects may be seen by companies as the signal is that the political and compliance risks of building factories in the United States have exceeded expectations. Jiang Fengxi, South Korean chief of staff to the president, who welcomed the personnel, acknowledged that the U.S. and South Korea have differences in the interpretation of the B-1 visa. A comprehensive observation points, first, Trump's immigration policy and investment attraction policy are contradictory, causing this major conflict. Second, Trump has forced U.S. allies to invest and build factories in the United States. The problem is that local governments are unable to hire the right people. It is worth noting that the South Koreans arrested this time are not grassroots personnel, but have professional skills, some of whom are even engineers. This shows that it is difficult to hire investment people from all levels of government to build factories in the United States. How can foreign companies operate under these circumstances? America's desire to bring manufacturing back is simply unattainable. Third, as Kim Tae-hyung, professor and head of the Department of Political Science at Sungsil University in Seoul, said, South Korea feels as if it has been stabbed in the back, a deep betrayal. Most Koreans simply cannot contain their anger. As a result, it is inevitable that Korean companies will feel discouraged about their investment plans in the United States. After all, no company can operate at a loss for the long term. Fourth, South Korea as a whole has long been torn between choosing sides in the US-China rivalry. Washington had originally made it clear that it encouraged Korean companies to build factories in the United States in an attempt to reduce dependence on China. But this time, the enforcement actions affecting these projects will inevitably complicate bilateral relations, and Korean companies really need to reflect on this. Was it the right choice to invest in the US and reduce dependence on China?